Hello, this is ChillQuest. In this guide, I'll be showing my exotic Leosthenes build, focused on using a two-handed mace that combines Geomancy and Arcanist to create a battle mage, in case anyone wants to follow this path. Before starting, I'll briefly explain what this build offers. First, it's important to know that this build focuses on control, mainly through daze and stun effects, which is exactly why I chose this combination. With both the two-handed mace and the Geomancy and Arcanist skill lines, it's possible to inflict these states on enemies. Another reason for this combination is that I wanted to create a build where buffs come mostly from magic and the weapon itself, without relying too much on warfare or athletics, and still manage to become a true battle mage. As for strengths, this build stands out for its versatility and fun factor. It constantly controls the battlefield using Geomancy, creating rock barriers and pillars that not only protect us, but also grant passive buffs throughout the game, eventually even providing strong damage through rock missiles. The Arcanist part helps with mobility, allowing repositioning, setting enemies into vulnerable positions, and also providing key buffs. Finally, the two-handed mace gives us close combat capability, but these fights are always supported by the rocks that buff the character, debuff enemies, and apply control effects before they even reach our range. Essentially, magic sets the stage, softens up the enemies, and then the mace unleashes its full potential. Now let's go over how each skill tree works. I'll try to demonstrate on the dummies how some key aspects of each branch function, and later I'll briefly explain the synergy between them. Let's start with the 2H Mace Tree. First of all, the default passive of two-handed maces gives critical hits, a 3-tile cleave damage, and a 50% chance to apply daze, which already tells us that if we manage to get good critical hit chance with this build, it becomes quite powerful. Keeping that in mind, let's go through the skills that make this build a true battle mage. Mighty Swing is one of the core abilities of this build, not only because it deals a lot of damage and crowd control, but also because when combined with certain passives, it gains extra functionality. For example, with the Keep Them Coming passive, if you land a critical hit or kill an enemy while Mighty Swing is active, you restore energy, which is very useful for maintaining ability, uptime in a battle mage build. Then we have another key ability that acts as our finisher. This skill deals massively increased damage against stunned enemies, has a 50% chance to crit, and if Mighty Swing is active, it extends the stun duration, turning it into a true massacre move. The only stance we use in this build is Striker stance. It boosts our CC, critical hit chance, and armor penetration. The following passive is also very useful. If the stance is active and we kill an enemy, we restore energy based on our willpower, which is one of our key stats. Additionally, when Mighty Swing is active, we get a 20% chance to stun on hit and a 4-turn cooldown reduction on abilities, extremely valuable for keeping momentum in battle. Finally, there's Unstoppable Force, a skill that allows us to push enemies away and grants bonuses per enemy pushed. If Mighty Swing is active, it also adds 2 turns of cooldown to the enemy's abilities, which is quite powerful. Combined with the Unbalanced passive, it debuffs enemies, making every close quarters encounter play out in our favor. Now, let's move on to our magic branch, focused on utility and versatility. Arcanist. This tree allows us to create strong offensive combos by selecting vulnerable enemies and finishing them off with the mace. It also helps us defend against ranged attacks and maintain control of the battlefield. Let's take a closer look. We start with Wormhole and Dimensional Shift. These skills offer many tactical options. The classic combo is to open a wormhole, switch positions with Dimensional Shift, and wait for the enemy with high chances of a stun. You can imagine how effective that is for a two-handed mace setup. Very interesting. You can also delay enemy advances while placing rocks and preparing the ground for when they fall into the wormhole trap. There are plenty of creative possibilities here. Then we have Arcane Might, a very strong skill that grants combat bonuses as you deal arcane damage. And guess what? Not only Arcanist deals arcane damage, Geomancy does as well with most of its skills. So this buff becomes extremely valuable across the entire build. Next, we have our main defensive tool against ranged damage, useful against both mages and magic projectiles. It provides damage resistance and reduction, and when we take damage with the shield active, we recover energy based on the amount of damage received. Very handy for energy sustain. Now, about Schism. This skill is super useful. Besides its damage and crowd control effects, it allows us to attack from behind our own rock walls, which works perfectly with the defensive setups you've already seen in the series. Finally, our panic button or close-range defense skill, Stasis. It's mainly used to incapacitate nearby enemies, reposition, and rebuild the battlefield with Geomancy's rocks. It's an extremely practical tool to recover control when things get rough. Now let's focus on Geomancy, our magic branch that provides the most control and battlefield setup. It also gives us excellent buffs and damage, and in my opinion, it defines our playstyle. The foundation of every Geomancer is Runic Boulder. From these, everything else emerges. Simply summoning them gives us buffs. And if there are adjacent enemies, they are pushed and take arcane damage. Furthermore, if you push an enemy into another object, not only do they take damage, but they also enter daze. And if they were already dazed, they go into stun. This is one of the core mechanics we use in our build. Next, we have the Geomancy passives, with Rune of Fortifying. In addition to making our boulders more durable, each adjacent boulder grants us buffs, and importantly, it reduces the energy cost for keeping boulders summoned. We'll put this into practice to show how it works. We just saw how our damage taken decreases as we place boulders adjacent to us. Now, let's look at another boulder passive. This one is also a stack-based buff, but it doesn't require adjacency. Simply summoning boulders gives us energy recovery and reduced cooldowns for geomantic spells per stack. Very useful in the early game to maintain energy, and in the late game to cast more spells with very high cooldowns. Let's see how it works with a skill heavily used in the late game, which I'll explain later, but needs to be used now due to its long cooldown. Boulder Toss, or as I like to call it, Rock Missile. Notice that once I cast the skill, it goes on a very long cooldown, but every time I summon a new boulder, the CD decreases significantly. This passive is very practical. Watch it in action. Now we have another boulder passive, but this time it's a debuff to enemies. Each boulder adjacent to an enemy reduces their physical defense and resistances, and one of these is Control Resistance, which is what we care about to stun enemies. Very useful. Let's see how the stats drop on the dummies. As you know, if an enemy destroys your boulder, besides dealing damage, there's a chance it will put you in a confused state, which can be very annoying at times. But with this new passive, that's no longer a problem as long as the boulder is near you. This allows us to create walls around ourselves without worrying about enemies destroying them. And importantly, we can summon 4 boulders, even though the usual maximum is 3. Now let's look at a very important passive that follows the Petrification skill. This solves all energy recovery problems because it allows us to steal energy from enemies adjacent to the boulders. Super useful. It lets us use medium armor and I'd say even heavy parts. Although I haven't tested that yet, on the dummies you can see how I steal energy. It's like having infinite energy. And lastly, in Geomancy we have our armor, which we'll practically be wearing at all times during combat. It provides a lot of defense, allowing us to endure short fights. And sometimes we can even use it offensively. Because, as you know, when it expires or when we cast a new armor, The previous one explodes based on how many times we were hit while it was active. It not only deals damage, but also pushes enemies away, giving us more crowd control potential than you might imagine. And now we move on to Magic Mastery, where we continue enhancing our combat through magic. The classic Battle Mage combo, Seal of Power, which grants elemental damage and other benefits depending on the spell you cast, combined with Body and Spirit, which boosts physical damage through magic and magical damage through physical attacks. Very useful for adding offense on both sides. As for Seal of Finesse, I was honestly surprised to read that it reduces the chance of fumble attacks. That's when I knew I'd definitely go for this seal, since two-handed flails have a high fumble chance, and together with the reduced backfire chance, it was an easy decision. Then we have the Spell Armor Penetration passive, which is really handy because Geomancy doesn't have much armor penetration on its spells. Compared to other magic schools, it's quite low. And finally, we've got a passive that reduces energy cost and lowers the cooldown of the next spell after casting a positive buff. Let's see if I can show you roughly how it works, with a few tests here. There we go. By activating 4 buffs, the cooldown went from 14 turns down to 10 turns. An interesting detail to keep in mind. Small things like this can really make a difference. And now let's move on to our gear, starting with the weapon, since I think it's an important topic to discuss. Because this is a hybrid build, and we need to spend points on willpower for the magic side, we have to consider the fumble attack chance of the flail. I'd recommend starting out with a regular blunt weapon until you reach the late game, because in my build, I only upgraded Seal of Finesse during the last levels. And that's when I found the flail became the better option, since it greatly reduced the fumble chance while staying on the same tile, as you can see here on screen. Now let's move on to our armor and jewelry. And there's something important I want to mention. Your gear will change depending on the stage of the game. As you can see, right now we're wearing medium armor to avoid heavy energy penalties. I do think we could use heavy armor once we unlock the energy drain passive from the boulders, but not before that. For jewelry, we're looking for a bit of magic power, bleed resistance, and accuracy, all things that help balance this hybrid build. The only offensive and light piece are the gloves, since they give bonus critical damage and reduce fumble chance, which is very important. However, I want to make something clear. You can't start this build with this setup, because you'll run out of energy very quickly. In the early game, you'll play with a blunt weapon and boulders, using light warrior armor. In the mid-game, you'll switch to battle mage or even mage armor, to gain skill, cost reduction, and energy restoration, playing more tactically and relying on crowd control. Only in the late game should you transition to this tankier version of the build. I wanted to point that out in case anyone wants to follow my progression, step by step. And to wrap up the guide, I'll show you the skill and stat progression throughout the game. At the start, I put 15 points in Perception and 15 in Vitality. Perception was very useful, not only for accuracy, critical hits, miracles, and armor penetration, but also because it increased skill range, allowing me to have more reach with my Arcanist spells and better set up the battlefield with my boulders. Very handy. Vitality helped me gain energy regeneration in the early game, and a bit more survivability thanks to the increase in maximum health. After that, I raised willpower to 20 because my spells were starting to deal significant damage, and I was preparing for the late game. Finally, I first raised Perception to 20 and then willpower to 25. My ranged damage was mainly magical, and regarding blunt weapon damage in close combat, enemies had so many debuffs that it allowed for quite high damage, and sometimes I could chain over 3 stuns in a row. essentially free damage. And that's it for this build. My experience with it was very good and fun, and I recommend it for tactical players who enjoy synergies with status effects like stuns and daze, as well as controlling the battlefield. It really met my expectations and even exceeded them. I hope that if you ever try it, you can enjoy it as much as I did. That's mainly why I'm sharing this build. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, so we can continue creating content like this and build a community of players who love learning and experimenting with tactical builds.